So we'll record this starting now. And so first of all, I just would like to say welcome everyone for joining our last talk of our Spring 2022 seminar series from Design++. I'm very happy to see so many people joining today. Here's a quick overview of all of our talks that we have hosted this semester. It is also on our website. We also host the past talks on our YouTube channel. So if you have missed a talk or also would like to look through previous topics, feel free to look there. As you might have already seen, the three of us run the day-to-day business of Design++, and so we're happy to welcome you to this talk today. And just to give you a brief introduction to our speaker today, we'll have Professor Sarah Billington present on a talk titled Hybrid Physical and Digital Spaces for Enhanced Sustainability and Wellbeing. So Professor Sarah Billington is the chair and UPS Foundation Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering and Senior Fellow in the Woods Institute for Environment at Stanford University. So from 1998 to 2002, she was an assistant professor at Cornell. She received her BSE with high honors in civil engineering and operations research and a certificate in architecture studies from Princeton University, and her MS and PhD in structural engineering from the University of Texas at Austin. Her past research focused on sustainable, durable construction materials, including bio-based composites and ductile cement-based composites. Her current research focuses on the impact of building design and materials on human well-being and on the public acceptance of affordable housing. If you'd like to know more about her work, you can also look at the URL below. And with that, Sarah, we're really happy to welcome you today.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I'm really excited to be here. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Oh, wait, I think you have to stop your share and then I can do mine. Thank you. Okay, is that looking good? Okay, great. Thank you so much. I realize now that I should have given you a slightly longer version of my bio, because in between college and grad school, I spent a year at the ETH in Zurich. And I really, really enjoyed my year. So before I start in, I want to just share a little bit from that with you, because so this was me at my going away party on the left from Zurich. And I don't remember what the picture on the right was, but I know that my brother and sister-in-law were visiting me, and we were clearly having a lot of fun. But just a couple of weeks ago, all of the guys that I mostly hung out with while I was there sent me this picture, and it was just sort of a throwback. Like literally, I haven't heard from them like probably almost since I left, and so it was just really, really fun. And this is Rolf, and this is Danny. He's way up there and down here, and then Ollie. Still in the middle of everything. So it was just really fun. I had such a wonderful, wonderful year there, and I wish I could be there in person to give this talk, but this Zoom works great too. So really excited to be here. Thank you. So yeah, the title of my talk is Hybrid Physical and Digital Spaces for Enhanced Sustainability and Wellbeing. This is a very large kind of team effort with colleagues and students, mostly from Stanford. And Brandon, who's on the call here, also was helping with us. I'll point that out when we get there. And another colleague, Liz Murnane, who's listed below, she was a postdoc at Stanford, but is now on the faculty at Dartmouth College. And so this is really representing a very wide array of people, which I'll also show in the talk. So the motivation for this work is that Americans, and I think most people in wealthy nations, spend almost 90% of their time inside buildings. Much of our time that is spent in buildings is at work, where many of us are often feeling overstressed, isolated, kind of sedentary, can be uninspired, can often be wasteful. And again, we're spending 90% of our time indoors, often in these states. So imagine the worst room you've ever spent time in, just for a minute. And then think about like how it made you feel. So for me, it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago now, I was in a 2-hour meeting in the morning at a faculty pub on campus. It was windowless with cinder block walls, and I really enjoyed the people I was with, but it was a really awful room. And when I left, I just had this visceral feeling of suddenly like feeling so much better. For my colleague James, it was his grad student office. Some of you might be experiencing that. He almost dropped out. But maybe you haven't had that experience. Maybe you have nicer offices there. And so if you imagine this workplace, this is, oh, I think I forgot to share the sound. So I'm not sure if you'll hear this, but I'll go ahead and try to make it loud here. Oh, wait, could you hear that? No? Okay.
No, I don't hear any sound.
Let me see if that.
The quality
Anyway,
is, yeah. Okay.
I forgot to share the sound. Can you hear me still? Okay, great. So anyway, imagine typical office noise, right? It can be very noisy. It has lots of unnatural light, pretty artificial furniture, no sense of nature. And it's hard to get work done here and to feel good. And so our argument is that this office environment is not only impacting, we'll call her Kate, the woman in the office, by feeling stress, anxiety, distraction, but it's also affecting her ability to collaborate with others. And these impacts have not only those individual outcomes on Kate, but also they affect the organization's finances, the way people waste resources, and even the cultural norms of the organization. And this in turn can have an impact on society, our economy, our environment, our health, and our well-being. So it might seem like it's hard to believe that buildings have this big an effect, although maybe this audience, you're an easy audience and you understand that. But it's, let me just give you one sort of concrete example of this. So in the United States, absenteeism costs companies about $226 billion a year. Now, most of this admittedly might be too long hours or low pay, a lousy boss, but the type of office space actually matters too, is our argument. And one study actually indicated that offices that lack nature can account for almost 10% of the absenteeism of that organization. If this were true in general, that would be like $23 billion in the US economy. But even if this impact was just a couple percent, because that was just one study, right? But even if it's just a couple percent, it's still several billion dollars. So we really do need to pay more attention to our built environment and what it's doing to us. So the research on how to do better is not very thorough. This is a great quote. Well, actually, I'll start here. Yeah, that Judith Herwagen, a famous environmental psychologist in the US, has said that more time and creativity has gone into designing natural habitats for zoo animals than creating comfortable spaces for office spaces for humans. And I would say that that's probably true from some of the things that I've seen, and in terms of the depth of the research, because there is a lot that's been on it, but it's not always very thorough because it's hard. It's hard to do this kind of research. So here's some things that we do know that have been shown. For instance, that natural light can lead to increased productivity and better concentration. We also know that visual connection to nature and greenery improves mood and attention. And we know that social engagement can reduce stress. We don't know so much how we can inspire that through our built environment in many ways, but we're working on that. And there are a lot of guidelines that are being developed to try to promote well-being in buildings and sustainability. But most of these on the well-being side, and I'm listing a few that are prominent in the US, most are focusing on amenities or also building systems traditionally, so heating and cooling and air. There's limited attention to built features, with the exception, I think, biophilic design has gotten a fair amount of attention. But most importantly, the research on effectiveness of these recommendations is relatively sparse. So there's a lot of sort of before-after studies, or it's on pretty limited populations, not longitudinal, and a lot relying almost entirely on self-report, which we know doesn't always represent what's really going on with people. So I want to talk a little bit about the biophilic design part, because I think that's where there's a lot of opportunities to be a little bit more rigorous about understanding how much is needed essentially in the built environment to improve our well-being. So biophilic design, that I imagine a lot of you have heard of or about. Okay, great. Yeah, humans basically are biologically hardwired with an innate connection to nature, and maintaining this connection to nature in built environments is really essential. There are decades of research that show benefits of a connection to nature, starting with Edward Wilson's book Biophilia, and it's been brought into design by Stephen Keller in a biophilic design book that tons of recommendations. And most recently, there's a nice small compilation of called 14 Patterns of Biophilic Design that was done in conjunction with a nonprofit and Google. And it's a little bit of a riff off on Christopher Alexander's pattern language, those of you that have studied architecture. And it's so it sort of boils it down to a few things. But in general, we know that this connection to nature can reduce stress, enhance creativity, expedite healing, and those sorts of things. So in the 14 patterns, there's sort of three characterizations: nature in the space, natural analogs, and then also nature of the space. And I couldn't be there in Zurich, and unfortunately you can't be here at Stanford, so I'm going to give you three examples of buildings on campus at Stanford that kind of demonstrate these sort of three broad areas of biophilic design. So for nature in the space, this is our Bing concert hall on campus. And you can see clearly that there is actually literally nature in the space. So this was sort of the trees growing in kind of a slot basically within the building. There's also kind of a natural analog in that they made the mullions kind of diagonal to sort of represent trees and branches. But so that's an example of nature in the space as well as natural analog. But there's a visual connection to nature, also just being able to see it outside. And then another natural analog would be this one, the Windover Contemplative Center. It's a very lovely small space on campus to get away from everything. And this is a rammed earth wall using local geological materials. So that's an example of a material connection with nature, reflecting local nature and geology. And then finally, another one would be the nature of the space. This is the Y2E2 building that my office is in. And the example here, one of the most famous ones, I guess, or well-known ones for nature of the space would be refuge and prospect. So you have sort of that safety, but you can see out in front of you. This is, I sort of joke about this, but another one of those patterns is risk and peril. So like these like glass bridges, I actually saw there's several in Switzerland. They're quite scary to go over, but they, that sort of feeling of like risk, but not too much because that would stress you out. But in our case, we've got a 3-story atrium down the middle of the building, actually 3 different places. So a little bit scary, and this also again shows the nature of the space getting dappled light, for example. So those are lots of different examples of how we can design in ways that connect us to nature. And yeah, so another great example is mass timber. At least in the US now, we're allowed to design buildings that are 18 stories with that. That's been allowed in many countries prior, but we're able to do that now, go above 5 stories. So that's a nice example for structural engineers of biophilic design. So a question is like, how much impact can this biophilic design have? And then a further question that we're starting to consider is how much do you need to really make an impact? And as I mentioned before, existing research is sparse. So it's, again, small populations, short-term studies, predominantly self-report. This is a nice quote from Mary Davidge, who was a director of campus design at Google for many years. I don't know what you call someone when they retire from a company, but I gave her the emerita title. And so she basically points out that there's a huge gap between what research has been done and then actually getting it done in practice and seeing how it works. So out in the field, it's just very messy. Conducting that research at scale and executing on it is very hard. So that's actually what we are interested in doing. Let's see, it's not advancing. Hold on. Okay, there we go. And so our project, the HPDS, is hybrid physical digital spaces. And the team is shown here. So it's taking a lot of people. So we have a lot of people in orange that are related to buildings, whether on campus. Some of them are campus people from land, building, and real estate, and architects, engineers, and then computing, so mostly human-computer interaction, and then some people with expertise in security. And then the people side, a lot of experts from psychology, psychiatry, also some privacy experts from law, and social science researchers in general. And the research questions that we're asking are sort of twofold. One is sort of more on the science side, and one is more on the engineering design. The first being, how do these built features actually impact the occupants in sort of in a more scientific way? And we're trying to monitor how they're impacting them with more than just self-report. And then once we understand how these features are impacting occupants, how can we design buildings that promote well-being over time, sort of continually, whether that's through an automated system, just something going to the building manager to do something more long-term, or prompting actual occupants who can have the agency to have more control over their environment. So I'm going to talk mostly about what we've been doing in terms of how do the built features impact the occupants, because we took a step back from jumping right into field studies and did some more, did a very controlled lab study, but also some online studies. So, but first, the vision of this is that we want to be using all of the possible sources of information that we have in buildings. So there's certainly self-report, and there's building data from building sensors, and then personal devices that we're wearing. And by getting this information, we can get it together basically and try to infer people's well-being. And that's where the CS folks come in with inferring that through machine learning and AI. And so we're focused on well-being outcomes, the ones that are listed here, and they represent sort of 4 realms of well-being. So there's stress, belonging, creativity, and physical activity. So that's for psychological well-being, social well-being, cognitive well-being, and physical well-being, there's 4. And then recently there have been studies that show that pro-environmental behavior does have a positive impact on well-being. So that's why we chose those 5 outcomes, because some of them are a little bit more new or unusual. And we're not so interested in like productivity. We're not interested in doing this to like wring every possible thing out of an employee, get them to work like super efficiently or something. Although some of that is people like to work efficiently, so that there's a little bit of that. But again, these are the outcomes that we're focused on. More recently, we've also been adding a different measure, which is sort of an overarching one, kind of related to positive affect or happiness. So this technology that we'll use to measure these different outcomes is shown here just as an example. So now we have Kate back in a nicer office. And if you think about trying to monitor stress, you could use an occupancy sensor to understand how many people are nearby, how much interaction she's having with people. You can use experience sampling methods. It's a type of self-report, like through her phone, just quick check-ins about how she is stressed or not. You can use the mobile phone, for affect from speech. You can get that in a privacy-conserving manner. And one of our colleagues has been able to pick up stress from trackpad usage. So you'd have these 3 pieces of information, and you could try to infer how the person is doing, if they're stressed or not. A lot of this would be done more on the research realm and not necessarily have to be doing all of this monitoring once we understand better what's going on. But this is just an example of the technology we use. And then for belonging, it could be very similar. How much interaction is happening? What's the social interaction, the affect from the speech that's going on? And then one's sense of belonging. So same kind of idea. So that's how we would be capturing the data. So our first step has been to start developing this platform that can actually collect all this data to try to infer these well-being outcomes. So we can do this with personal devices like smartwatches, or we've been in the lab, we've been using the Empatica so that we can get heart rate variability. We can use building data to get different, air quality, CO2, light, humidity, that kind of thing. And then we've created a mobile client for the sort of the experience sampling method, the self-report. But that's a little bit more of the realm of the computer scientists on the project. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of these studies that we've run together. So once the data platform is created, you can go out in the field. But for now, we've been doing online studies and a very controlled, rigorous lab study to get ready for the field studies. And we're actually about to launch a field study, and of course the pandemic hit, so we ended up doing more online studies. So let me start with the first online study we did, which was just a very simple one to try to get a sense of, like, especially with belonging. Do materials, do things in the built environment even matter for belonging? So we conducted this first online study in January of 2018, well before the pandemic. And we did find, as I'll show you, that it seemed like there were going to be some impacts of light and materials, and also sort of diverse representations of diversity on the walls. And so we found that, which I'll show in a minute. And then we launched into a very big lab study, which is shown down here. And then we finished the lab study on March 15th, 2020. So that date should kind of ring a bell. So like 2 days later, we were in lockdown. And so that was fortunate that we got the lab study then, but we weren't able to then start to go into the field at all. So we went back to doing online studies. And we repeated this first one. Then in July 2020, we got different results slightly, which I'll talk about. So then we did it again. Then we went ahead and did the same kind of online study using the pictures from the lab study. So that's just a kind of a quick explanation of why we have 5 different online studies. We did a meta-analysis of that. So I'm going to talk about the first one, which led us to the lab study. I'll go chronologically kind of, and then talk about going back into the more of the online studies for what we found. So for the online studies, these were our variables. So we were wondering, do materials, whether they're natural or artificial, and light, whether it's natural light or not, which in the end actually ended up being window or no window, was a better way to say that. And then representations on the wall, diverse or not diverse. And we were interested in understanding, how do those impact sense of belonging, self-efficacy, so your ability to be productive and do well in that space, and then environmental concern. And our hypotheses were that the natural light, the natural materials, and the diverse representations will promote belonging, self-efficacy, and environmental concern over the non-natural and the artificial and the non-diverse. So this first study that we did had 272 participants, so sort of one of these crowdsourcing platforms, MTurk, excuse me. And the scenario was, okay, this is your new place of work. We're going to show you a series of pictures of your new place of work. Imagine you're starting a new job. Answer these questions. There were 9 questions. And they actually saw 5 sets of pictures of each one of these conditions. So it was within subjects. And across the board, the participant pool looked like this. So it was about 50% female, 73% white, 53% had a bachelor's degree, mean age of 36. So this wasn't bad in terms of US representation, but that's just the demographics. So across the board, with the natural light, natural materials, natural light pictures, and diverse representations, almost everything went up. So sense of belonging and efficacy, environmental concern for all, for materials and light, and then just environmental concern for diverse representations. But this was interesting, exciting that this seemed to matter. But of course, it was just people looking at pictures. And so we're like, okay, well, there's at least some promise, and we want to get into the lab. Let me just show you a different way of representing the data, because all the rest will kind of look more like this. This is from the ANOVAs, where we could find that the natural materials, the natural light, and the diverse representations were statistically significant, had statistically significant increases relative to the artificial counterparts or the non-diverse counterparts. Okay, So we were actually particularly excited about the idea that just the materials or the light could increase a sense of belonging, because in the US, there have been studies that have shown that the profits, so the mean revenues of 506 different for-profit businesses, were greater in firms that had higher levels of gender and racial diversity, respectively, relative to firms with lower diversity. I still need to get what their overall was because it's better to give that in a percentage. But basically, an increase in profit when you have a more diverse workforce. And I think there are lots of examples of that. Even in academics here, some things have gone much better when we've got a more diversity of thought in the leadership. So if retention can be an issue in some companies, and so if you can help even a little bit just with the materials and the building design, that seems like a kind of low-hanging fruit. So anyway, we thought that this was promising, that materials and light could have this impact in diverse representation. So we went ahead and designed a more controlled lab study. And this one had 412 participants. We conducted this on campus at Stanford. It was a double-blind experiment, so the participants didn't know what it was about, and the people that were actually helping people in the rooms to get set up didn't know what it was about. We had it under the heading of a professional development study, which was funny because we pasted it all around, and then the Stanford Professional Development Office called and said, "What are you doing?" So we had to explain. But it was, and the people were compensated for their time. It was a big lesson for me coming from doing lots of research on concrete and polymers to suddenly doing human subjects research. There's a lot of preparation here. So this is a little bit pixelated, but this was what the study looked like in terms of, we had two rooms that were, one had the natural materials and one had the artificial materials. The N is just showing how many people ended up in each condition. It was randomly generated each morning, and they just moved furniture around and pictures on the walls to create the different conditions. But they were either, natural light or no natural light, with the natural materials or no natural materials. And then the pictures on the wall were either non-diverse or diverse. And so the diverse and non-diverse, that was sort of piloted. We tried to find pictures that were of people on campus. And we did kind of a quick pilot where people just rated the pictures based on things like, were they happy? Was it diverse? Is there natural light? Like, just different kinds of emotional responses to the pictures. And then these were the ones that ranked the highest for representing diversity, and these were ranked the highest for not representing diversity. There was actually a woman in this one, we photoshopped her out, but she was small. So anyway, so that was what we did there for those representations on the wall. So the way the study worked was people would check in, sign a consent form, and then they would sit down at that table that you saw. It was sort of set up like a conference room, and there was a laptop facing the window or the wall there. And then they had 4 tasks to do that were in random order. And then there was like a counterbalance kind of filler task in between. And that took anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes, depending on the participant. And we were measuring stress, creativity, environmental concern, basically, or behavior, and belonging. And then there were also some objective measures, which I'll show in a minute. And then they had a post-survey video release, and the raffle question had to do with charitable giving towards an environmental cause. So as I mentioned, we were interested in more than just self-report. So for these different well-being outcomes, in belonging, it really was just self-report. For stress, we had self-report, but also the sensors on the wrists to get the physiological stress. For creativity, it was self-report as well as 2 tasks. So for convergent and divergent creativity, and for pro-environmental behavior, again, self-report as well as behavior through the charitable donation. So just sort of trying to get at that, a bit of, we couldn't quite do triangulation here, but a little bit. And I mentioned we couldn't quite do triangulation because we did put all of the building sensors in. It wasn't part of our hypotheses. So this was more just kind of exploratory, gathering the data to see how much variation there is in a lab setting. So we had all kinds of indoor air quality sensors throughout the room for CO2, particulates, temperature, humidity. And so this is basically kind of all of the data streams that we had with all of the different things that we were able to measure. Yeah, actually, I forgot. Yeah, they were wearing 2 watches, both an Apple Watch and the Empatica. Okay, so lots of data coming in to play with. The demographics for this study were pretty typical for a campus study in that it was because it was a lot of staff and graduate students. We wanted people that had been working in office environments. And so we did not use undergraduates. And as is typical on the campus, the participant pool was predominantly female. We have a very large international population at Stanford, so it was pretty diverse from that respect. Not at all diverse from the respect of everyone having pretty much a bachelor's degree. And the affiliation was about 50% graduate students, mean age of 33. So I'm going to show you the statistical results from the analyses, the ANOVAs next. It's under this big green box. But just to walk you through it before we look at, it's going to be a big table. But so there was the dependent variables of the belonging, the stress, creativity, pro-environmental behavior, and then independent variables of materials, light, and the representations on the wall. And the things that have a little green box behind them when I go forward are the ones where we had some statistical significance or trends. So mostly what we had was that with the natural materials, both the self-reported stress and the physiological stress were reduced in the presence of the natural materials. So there was a faster recovery from the stress task. And if you're curious, ask me what we did to stress them out. But that was kind of the biggest thing that we found. And what was exciting was that we could find it in 2 different ways, both measured from the watch as well as their self-report. We also found that the presence of natural light improved the negative arousal, or was better for them stress-wise, essentially. And we found that that the stress was also reduced slightly for some populations with the diverse representations. And same thing, there was a little bit increase of charitable behavior. Those were just trends, not statistically significant, but increase in charitable behavior in the presence of the window. So this was exciting, and particularly that stress finding with the materials, finding it with the 2 different data streams. And so we then we were analyzing the data and planning for a lab or a field study in New York City in an office building, and the pandemic hit. So we decided to step back and look more at the online study and just do more online studies basically during the pandemic. And so, as I mentioned before, so this brings us to around here, and we decided to repeat these results because we realized, okay, it's 2 years later. It took a long time to do that lab study. Let's see what's happening. Is it still the same? Of course, there are also issues because it was the pandemic, but we tried that. And then, well, as you'll see, they were slightly different. So then we just thought it had to do with seasons. So we did it again in the next winter. And then we decided, as I mentioned, to try it out with our lab study pictures. So let me show you what I mean by that. So the first online study was sort of immersive. I mentioned that we showed them 5 pictures of each condition and said, okay, imagine these are in your workplace, and then asked them those questions, right? So they it was sort of higher dosage, I'd say, for example, of natural materials that they were seeing. So we didn't get, the belonging was the one that kind of held from the online study to the lab study, and we didn't get much on belonging at all in the lab study. I think it was partly due to the way we framed the question, unfortunately. But we were also wondering, does it have to do with like staring at 5 pictures versus just being in a room that has pictures on the wall? So sort of, we call that kind of like the dosage. And so we decided we were rerunning these again, but we also decided to go ahead and show these pictures in the lab for the lab study to see if that, but with the same questions as the first study to see if that kind of dosage mattered. Okay, so we ended up doing 5 online studies. So the first one I already told you about, and then we repeated it twice. And so we're calling that immersive because it was kind of like a more intense dosage of the treatment. And then studies 4 and 5, I'll refer to as the lab photos. because they're literally from that lab study. And we did also show them a close-up of the pictures. So for these studies, so 1, 2, 3 were all the immersive, and 4 and 5 were the lab. There was an A and a B with the 4 and the 5, because with the 4, we showed them all pictures and asked them the questions each time they saw the picture. But we also then just took the people that saw the first picture. So that would be within studies. We also just took the people that only saw just the first room they all saw. So everyone only saw one room is essentially what it is. And that would be kind of a between subjects. And then study 5 was truly a between subjects where they only saw one room. Okay, so these were the gender and race and education, the demographics. And they were kind of similar. I think the biggest difference was that there were more people with bachelor degrees once COVID hit. And the gender wasn't quite as 50-50, that varied a little bit, but not huge swings, I would say. I'm sorry, actually, so the white population went from 2/3 to 3/4, and the more educated went from 50-50 to 2/3, but same median age. Okay, so for these online studies, the 5 studies, we did the ANOVAs. We also looked at interaction effects. I'm just going to show you the ANOVAs because it compares nicely to the first one, or it's just easier to understand quickly. But then we did a meta-analysis. This was proposed by the psychology professor to analyze the consistency of the results across all 5 studies. And that was kind of interesting. So for the, so I'll start with the materials. So when we had the natural materials versus the artificial. With the immersive photos, we had increases in all of our outcomes, statistically significant. With the lab photos, we didn't find anything when they were looking at the lab photos instead. So it does seem like that dosage kind of matters. With light, there was a little bit more variation. And with the immersive photos, we didn't see anything in the second one. And we believe that this might have to do with the fact that it was summer. So these 2 were in winter. So people were at home, A, and B, it would probably be sunny. This was a national survey, but pretty much everyone would generally be sunny in the summer, as opposed to the winter. And then there wasn't much. But then there was a fair amount with the lab study with that large window. Okay, then with the representations, there wasn't much at all in the online studies, as I mentioned when we repeated that. There was a lot more with the lab photos. And one of the reasons we think that might be, so this was the study where people saw it over and over and over again. So they saw every single condition, the within condition. They were really just staring at pictures of people. In the first online study, there were some things that were a little bit more obscure, like sculptures or other kinds of artwork that might not have been as obvious what we were showing there, or not as perceived. So the meta-analysis was probably the most interesting. So as you know, probably it's the method to synthesize the findings from multiple independent studies that are on the same topic to try to get the overall collective effects. And there we did find that from across all 5 studies, the materials matter, the light matters with statistical significance, or at least with a trend, or it's right on the margin. I think it was. So in summary, am I doing the time? Okay, yeah. From the online study findings, we found that the natural materials and natural light increase the sense of belonging and the work self-efficacy and environmental concern. It seems that with more immersive experiences and seasonality, and then the study design, whether it's within or between subjects, can impact the results. So it's hard to be super conclusive. Also, by the way, the effect sizes are relatively small. The lab experiment findings, the natural materials definitely lowered physiological stress and self-reported negative arousal, as well as self-reported stress. There were marginal indications or trends that the window reduces negative arousal, increases positive arousal. The diverse representation lower reported stress, and natural materials increase the divergent creativity. So lots of little indications that we think are worth exploring. Another thing I'd want to mention is the methodological takeaways. So what I mean by that is there's no clearly optimal experimental setup, whether it's online or lab, and whether it's between subjects or within subjects. Like we don't have a definitive answer there. So there's just lots of ways to do these kinds of studies. The ability of measures to triangulate on findings was shown in terms of the stress in the self-report, and that was pretty exciting. We do know that there are studies that show people looking at a screen of like a beautiful nature scene will say, oh yes, it's very relaxing and calming, but actually physiologically they are rather aroused and it's not calming physically to them. So this idea of trying to get it in multiple different ways is definitely going to be more robust. And then another methodological takeaway, studying this impact of physical digital workplace is very ambitious and it requires a lot of iteration. And some people don't like sharing null results. I think it's really important because it's messy and I think it's a really fun field to be in and to be working on. And so I think it's just important to share everything that you're doing and finding and hash it out and try to figure out the best way to understand these things. In terms of future work, we are trying to do the online in a more immersive way. So watching videos or having the backdrop of the survey have like the wood in it. So for example, we think in the lab, because you're looking at the laptop on a wooden desk or table, you're more exposed than if you're just looking at a picture and then staring at a screen with a white background answering questions. So that's what we mean by having more immersive online labs. We're trying to replicate the lab study in VR because obviously it'll be a lot easier to try out different designs in VR than it is to get space on campus and rebuild it in different ways. And then in the field, we're still trying to set something up, probably going to do something local with Stanford's Redwood City campus nearby. And then one thing I didn't talk about here is that privacy and security is actually a huge part of the research we do. It's not my field, but we've done a lot of studies of people's acceptance of collecting this data and different ways of collecting the data or different ways of signaling that data is being collected. And so that's also a really rich field of research, I think, in this space. In terms of the design side of like what can be done, there are a lot of interesting things. I have colleagues looking at natural ventilation with having more user control or when there's mixed methods. Lots of physical things you can do about bringing greenery indoors. A lot going on, obviously, in the digital space, which I know many of you have a lot of expertise in, but having sort of ambient murals or digital things in windows that are signaling to people like the ways in which like they're using energy or how much exercise people are getting or any other kinds of things that could be done in sort of a more artistic way. We have lots of like screens around showing bar charts and stuff. Nobody really pays attention to them. So doing something a little more artistic would be nice. Yeah, so the vision would be that, you know, in the future, we can infer, enhance and support occupant well-being by adapting the physical and digital environment over time and continually updating over time. We'd made a little video about it. These are just snapshots from that. So yeah, overall, like we are, as you know, we're becoming more and more urban. Probably 70% of us will be living in urban environments by 2050. And not a lot of access to nature always in these urban environments. So the goal is to figure out how we can create that feeling of nature and have us still be connected to nature so that we can flourish inside our buildings in the future. And I'll stop there. Happy to answer any questions.
Cool, thanks.